What if the woman who destroyed your past was suddenly forced to face you for her future? In the glittering skyscrapers of New York, a brutal betrayal shatters a perfect marriage. A powerful CEO, Richard Sterling, coldly divorces his pregnant wife, Eleanor, for his ambitious mistress, Isabella. He leaves his wife with nothing but a broken heart and the child he'll never know. But fate has a long memory. 25 years later, a federal courthouse becomes a stage for the ultimate reckoning. A new judge, known for his unbending integrity, is assigned a landmark fraud case. The defendant, the ruthless Isabella Sterling. The judge, James Vance. The son, Richard, abandoned. Stay with us as we unravel a story where the gavel of justice is held by the hand of the victim. The penthouse on Park Avenue wasn't just a home, it was a statement. It was 30,000 square feet of Italian marble, floor-to-ceiling glass, and curated art that screamed new money, trying desperately to look old. This was the domain of Richard Sterling, the CEO and founder of Sterling Global Enterprises, a man who had devoured the worlds of logistics and private equity with the same predatory grace he used to navigate a gala. And beside him, the perfect accessory to his empire, was Eleanor Vance Sterling. She was not a product of his world. She was, he often thought, the last genuine thing he owned. Eleanor was Vassar-educated, with a quiet intelligence and a warmth that smoothed Richard's abrasive edges. She ran 3 of the city's largest charities, not for the photo ops, but because she genuinely believed in the work. Tonight, they were hosting their annual Sterling Foundation benefit. Men in bespoke Tom Ford suits, and women in cascading diamonds filled the space, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low murmur of strategic alliances. "Richard, darling," a voice purred, cutting through the din. It was Isabella Rossi, a junior analyst from Richard's M&A Mergers and Acquisitions department. She was everything Eleanor was not: sharp raven-haired, with eyes that didn't just look at you, but appraised you. She wore a crimson dress that seemed painted on a stark, deliberate slash of color in a room of elegant neutrals. "Isabella, you've been doing incredible work on the new Singapore fund," Richard said, his voice a professional baritone, but his eyes lingered a fraction of a second too long. Eleanor, standing nearby, felt a familiar cold prickle of unease. It had been happening for 6 months. The late nights Richard blamed on closing the Tokyo market. The sudden whispered phone calls he took on the terrace. The detached, almost clinical way he'd begun to look at her. She placed a hand on her stomach, a small, barely there curve. It was her secret, her anchor. She was 3 months pregnant. She was waiting for the perfect moment to tell him, a moment to shatter this strange new tension and bring him back to her. Later that night, after the last guest had departed, Eleanor found Richard in his study, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. The city lights reflected in his eyes, but he seemed to be seeing nothing. "Richard," she said softly, "can we talk?" "I'm busy, Eleanor. This Singapore deal is—" "It can wait," she said, her voice firmer now. She walked over and stood in front of him, blocking his view. "I have something to tell you. Something wonderful." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "What is it, Richard?" She took a breath, her hands shaking slightly as she took his and placed them on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby." She watched his face, expecting, what, shock, joy, elation. She got none of it. Richard Sterling's face went blank. It was the same look he gave a hostile board member right before a corporate execution. He didn't pull his hands away. He simply let them fall lifeless. "A baby," he said. The words were flat, dead. "Yes," she whispered, the joy in her chest turning to ice. Isn't it wonderful, Eleanor?" he said, turning from her and walking to his desk. He picked up a thick, cream-colored envelope. "We need to discuss the restructuring." "Restructuring? What are you talking about? Richard, did you hear me?" "I heard you," he said, not looking at her. He slid the envelope across the polished mahogany desk. "This is from Arthur Kensington, at Cravath, Swain and Moore. My attorney." Eleanor stared at the envelope. Her blood ran cold. "Your attorney?" "I'm filing for divorce," he said as calmly as if ordering lunch. "And I'm moving Isabella into the guest suite tomorrow while this is settled. It's time to consolidate my assets." Eleanor's world tilted. The room, the marble, the glass, the skyline, all of it blurred into a vortex of pain. "Isabella," she choked out. That child in the red dress, Richard, no, I'm pregnant. With your child." He finally looked at her. His eyes were not angry or sad. They were bored. They were calculating. "That," Richard Sterling said, straightening his tie, "is an unfortunate complication for you. Not for me. You see Eleanor in business, you cut your losses. You don't double down on a failing investment." He turned back to the window, the glittering city reflecting his ambition. "You'll be hearing from Arthur in the morning. He'll be generous, I'm sure. Within reason." Eleanor stood frozen, her hand on her stomach, a silent scream trapped in her throat. She had just announced the creation of a new life. And in response, he had just announced the execution of hers. The days that followed were not a divorce. They were a corporate dismantling. Eleanor learned quickly that the man she had loved for 7 years did not exist. In his place was Richard Sterling, CEO, and she was no longer a wife, but a hostile entity to be managed and neutralized. Arthur Kensington Richard's lawyer was a shark in a $5,000 suit. He was the kind of man who enjoyed breaking things just to see how they splintered. They met in a sterile conference room on the 50th floor of the Sterling Global building, a place Eleanor herself had helped design. "Mrs. Sterling," Kensington began, smiling a smile that never reached his eyes. "Richard is prepared to be very equitable." He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a settlement offer. Eleanor, despite her shock, was no fool. She'd read her own prenup years ago. She was entitled to 20% of his assets acquired during the marriage. With Sterling Global's explosive growth, that meant she was entitled to a fortune. The number on the paper was not a fortune. It was an insult. It was enough to buy a nice apartment in Brooklyn, perhaps. Not enough to live. It was go-away money. "This is a mistake," Eleanor said, her voice shaking but cold. "The prenup states—" "Ah, the prenup," Kensington interrupted, steepling his fingers. "Yes, a document. But documents, Mrs. Sterling, are subject to interpretation, and of course assets are a very fluid concept." "What does that mean?" "It means," Kensington said, leaning in, "that Sterling Global has been undergoing significant, and I must say brilliant restructuring for the last 8 months. Offshore holdings, new shell corporations. The on-paper value of Mr. Sterling's domestic assets to which the prenup applies is, well, it's what you see on that paper." Eleanor stared at him. He hid the money. He's been planning this for 8 months." "Mr. Sterling is a brilliant strategist," Kensington said, "in business and in life." "And Isabella," Eleanor whispered. "Miss Rosie," Kensington corrected, "has been invaluable in this transition. Her insights into international finance law are truly singular." The betrayal was deeper than she could have ever imagined. It wasn't a sudden, passionate affair. It was a cold, calculated coup. Isabella hadn't just seduced her husband. She had actively helped him liquidate Eleanor's entire future. And the baby, Eleanor's voice was barely audible. Kensington's smile vanished. Mr. Sterling is skeptical of the timing. He will, of course, contest paternity, a lengthy and no doubt public court battle, unless, of course, you accept the current offer and agree to a non-disclosure agreement that covers everything, for all time. It was a checkmate. He was threatening to drag her pregnant and humiliated through the New York tabloids, painting her as a liar and a gold digger, all while the real gold digger was redecorating her penthouse. That night, Eleanor didn't just pack her bags. She erased herself. She took her maiden name back, Eleanor Vance. She took the small inheritance her grandmother had left her, sold the jewelry Richard had given her. It felt like poison on her skin anyway, and bought a one-way train ticket to Boston. As the train slid out of Penn Station, she watched the Sterling Global Tower, her tower recede into the skyline. Isabella Rossi was already there. Paparazzi photos had captured her moving in not through the service entrance, but through the front lobby, bold and triumphant. 2 days after Eleanor arrived in Boston, the divorce was finalized. She signed the papers in a cramped notary's office that smelled of stale coffee. 7 months later, in a small hospital in Back Bay, Eleanor Vance gave birth to a son. He had her eyes, but he had Richard's determined chin. She held him to her chest, the pain and humiliation of the past year receding into a fierce, protective love. "Hello, James," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "James Vance. It's just you and me, and I promise you I will never let anyone hurt you. I will teach you everything about integrity and justice and honor, all the things he never knew." While Eleanor was learning to be a mother, Richard Sterling was on the cover of Forbes. He and Isabella Rossi were married in a lavish $10 million ceremony in Lake Como. The headline read, "The Ultimate Merger, Sterling and Rossi Combine Forces." Eleanor saw the magazine in a CVS checkout line. She looked at the photo of Richard and his new radiant bride. Then she looked down at the tiny sleeping face of her son. "He chose that," she whispered to James. "And I got you." It was not a fair trade, but in that moment, Eleanor Vance decided it would be a winning one. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. The next 25 years were a study in contrasts. In New York, the empire of Richard and Isabella Sterling grew into a colossus. Sterling Global Enterprises, now with Isabella as COO, became infamous for its ruthless take-no-prisoners expansion. They bought out competitors, stripped them for parts, and laid off thousands, all while their personal wealth ballooned into the tens of billions. They had a daughter, Chloe Sterling, who was raised by a team of nannies and became a notorious tabloid fixture, famous for her disastrous reality TV appearances and designer drug habits. Richard's life was a fortress of glass and steel, opulent, impressive, and utterly cold. He rarely, if ever, thought of the son he'd dismissed as a failing investment. In Boston, life was built on a different foundation. Eleanor Vance raised James in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Brookline. She worked as a paralegal during the day and put herself through law school at night at Suffolk University. She didn't just become a lawyer, she became a warrior. Eleanor joined the Legal Aid Society fighting for tenants, against slumlords, for spouses in domestic abuse cases, for all the people. The Richard Sterlings of the world, crushed without a second thought. She never poisoned James against his father. She didn't have to. She simply told him the truth once, when he was old enough to ask. "Your father," she told him over dinner when he was 12, "is a very successful man. But he made a choice. He chose his business over his family. He chose money over honor. That is his life. It is not ours. That conversation lit a fire in James. He saw his mother's exhaustion, her quiet dignity, her relentless fight for people who had no one. He didn't want his father's money or his name. He wanted to undo what his father represented. He inherited Richard's sharp intellect and ambition, but he filtered it through Eleanor's profound empathy and ironclad sense of justice. James was brilliant. He devoured books on history, philosophy, and law. He graduated top of his class, got a full scholarship to Harvard Law, and became the editor of the Law Review. While Chloe Sterling was being arrested for a DUI in a Lamborghini, James Vance was clerking for a federal judge. He didn't go into corporate law, where he could have named his price. He joined the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. He wanted to be in the arena. James Vance became a prosecutor known for his surgical precision and his utter lack of fear. He didn't just prosecute. He dismantled. His specialty was complex financial crime. He loved nothing more than taking down arrogant, untouchable white-collar criminals who believed the law was for other people. His closing arguments were legendary, not fiery, but cold, logical, and devastating. His most famous case was United States versus Peterson, where he successfully convicted a hedge fund billionaire, Mark Peterson, for a massive insider trading scheme. Peterson, much like Richard Sterling, had tried to hide his assets in a web of offshore accounts. James, with a near-obsessive zeal, had unraveled every single one. His success was meteoric. After 8 years as a prosecutor, his reputation for integrity and intellect was so profound that when a spot opened on the federal bench for the Southern District, his name was at the top of the list. At 34, James Vance became one of the youngest federal judges ever appointed in New York history. The Honorable James Vance. He bought his mother a beautiful brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, overlooking the very skyline that had once been her prison. On the day of his investiture, Eleanor stood in the packed courtroom, her eyes blurred with tears as her son put on the black robe. He was the living, breathing embodiment of her victory. James never used his father's name. He never contacted him. To him, Richard Sterling was just another headline, a symbol of the very corruption he had sworn a sacred oath to fight. He was a ghost, a cautionary tale. He had no idea that the ghost was about to walk into his courtroom. The downfall of Isabella Sterling didn't happen all at once. It was a masterpiece of hubris, a death by 1,000 cuts, all self-inflicted, as COO of Sterling Global. Isabella was the true engine of the company. Richard had become the figurehead, the aging lion who enjoyed the reputation, while Isabella did the actual killing. She was bolder than Richard, more reckless. She didn't just bend the rules. She rewrote them. Her great project was the Helios Initiative, a multi-billion-dollar acquisition of sustainable energy companies across South America. It was meant to greenwash Sterling Global's reputation and be her crowning achievement. But the Helios Initiative was a lie. The companies Isabella was acquiring were mostly worthless. They were shell corporations, many of which she secretly controlled through a labyrinth of offshore accounts registered in Panama and the Cayman Islands. She wasn't buying assets. She was siphoning Sterling Global's capital directly into her own pockets. It was a staggering, complex fraud. She was using company money to buy her own fake companies at massively inflated prices. She was cooking the books, filing false reports with the SEC, and lying to shareholders, all while pocketing billions. The first thread was pulled by a young, hungry analyst at the SEC. An algorithm flagged an irregular wire transfer, $50 million to a Panamanian holding company called Apex Solutions, an entity that seemed to have no employees and no office. The SEC started digging. They dug for 2 years. What they found was a criminal enterprise so vast it shocked even them. They referred the case to the U.S. Attorney's Office, James Vance's old stomping grounds. The feds built their case with the same meticulous care James himself would have used. They flipped a terrified junior accountant. They got wiretaps. They traced the money from Panama to a private vault in Switzerland, all under an alias I. Rossi. The indictment was explosive. Isabella Sterling was arrested by FBI agents at her favorite table at Le Bernardin in the middle of lunch. She was charged with 28 counts of wire fraud, securities, fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The media went insane. It was the biggest white-collar crime case of the decade. And then came the judicial assignment. The case, United States of America vs. Isabella Sterling, was assigned by random lottery. It landed on the desk of the Honorable James Vance. James saw the name on the case file. Sterling. His heart didn't stop. It didn't pound. It simply went cold. This was her. The woman in the red dress. The woman who had helped destroy his mother and cast him and Eleanor out into the dark. His clerk, a young woman named Sarah, looked at him. "Judge, you know who that is, right? That's Richard Sterling's wife. This is going to be a circus." James stared at the file. Ethics. The law was clear. Any appearance of bias was grounds for recusal. And this was the mother of all biases. He should recuse himself. He should hand it off to Judge Miller or Judge Chen. It was the safe, simple, ethical thing to do. He thought of his mother working 3 jobs while he was a baby. He thought of her crying at night when she thought he was asleep. He thought of the smug, triumphant face of Isabella Sterling on the cover of Forbes. And then he thought of his oath. To administer justice without respect to persons and do equal right to the poor and to the rich. He could be impartial. He knew he could. He would be harder on himself, more rigorous, more exacting than any other judge. He would not give her an inch of bias either for or against. He would be the pure, uncorrupted instrument of the law. He would show her and the world what real justice looked like. "Sarah," James said, his voice quiet and firm, "clear my calendar for the pretrial conference, and get me every filing from the prosecution and the defense. I'm not recusing." Sarah's eyes widened. "Judge, are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," James said, opening the file. "Mrs. Sterling has been assigned her judge. Let's get to work." The U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York was a fortress of justice. Courtroom 26B. James's courtroom was a grand oak-paneled room, and it was packed. The trial of Isabella Sterling was the hottest ticket in town. Journalists, legal analysts, and the simply curious filled every seat in the gallery. Isabella Sterling entered flanked by a high-priced legal team from Paul Weiss. She looked diminished. Gone was the triumphant COO. In her place was a woman in a severe beige suit, her black hair pulled back tightly. She looked pale, but her eyes were still defiant. She scanned the courtroom, her gaze sliding over James without a hint of recognition. To her, he was just a judge, a functionary in her way. "All rise," the bailiff called out. James entered from his chambers, his black robe settling around him. The room went silent. He sat the weight of the moment settling on him. He looked down at the defendant. "This court is now in session," James said, his voice echoing in the chamber. The case of the United States v. Isabella Sterling. Are both sides ready to present their opening statements? The trial began. For 2 weeks, the prosecution methodically laid out its case. They presented wire transfers, bank records, and the damning testimony of the accountant they had flipped. It was a clinical, devastating picture of greed. James presided with an icy calm, overruling and sustaining objections with textbook precision. He gave Isabella's defense team no room to complain of bias. Isabella's defense was simple. She was a woman in a man's world. She was the victim. She had been manipulated, set up, and framed by her own husband, Richard Sterling. On the 15th day of the trial, Isabella's lead attorney, Sharon Mills, stood. The defense calls Richard Sterling to the stand. A murmur went through the gallery. The grand doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and he walked in. James's breath hitched. He had not seen this man in person in his entire life. He had only seen the photos. The man who entered was older, grayer, and thinner than the Forbes cover. He looked broken. The predatory arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, weary fear. Richard Sterling walked to the witness box. He was sworn in. He sat his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Sterling," the defense attorney began. "You were the CEO of Sterling Global, correct?" "Yes," Richard said, his voice reedy. "And Isabella, your wife, was your COO?" "Yes." Who Mr. Sterling was really in charge. For the next 4 hours, the defense painted Richard as a weak, detached figurehead, a man who had long since lost control of his own company. And then they painted him as a conspirator who, upon finding out about the SEC investigation, had planted evidence to make Isabella the sole scapegoat. James watched his face an unreadable mask. He was judging a trial between the woman who destroyed his family and the man who abandoned him. The air in his lungs felt like static. Then it was the prosecution's turn for cross-examination. The AUSA Assistant U.S. Attorney, a sharp woman named Anya Sharma, approached the witness. "Mr. Sterling, your wife claims you framed her. Is that true?" "No, of course not," Richard said, his voice rising. I had no idea what she was doing. The shell company's the fraud. It was all her. She controlled the finances. I trusted her." "You trusted her," Sharma repeated. "Just as your first wife, Eleanor Vance, trusted you. Is that correct?" "Objection!" the defense screamed. "Relevance. This is character assassination. Sustained." James said, his voice level, though his knuckles were white on his gavel. "The jury will disregard the last statement. Ms. Sharma, move on." Sharma nodded, the point already made. She projected a new document on the screen. "Mr. Sterling, can you identify this document?" It was a bank transfer from Sterling Global to the Panamanian shell, Apex Solutions. But this one was different. It wasn't authorized by Isabella. It was authorized by R. Sterling. Richard stared at it. I don't remember this." "That's your signature, is it not?" Sharma pressed. "It looks like it, but Isabella, she handled all of that. She must have forged it." "So your testimony," Sharma said, "is that you are either a co-conspirator or a complete idiot. Which one is it, Mr. Sterling?" "Objection. Sustained," James said. He looked at his father. The man on the stand was a liar, a coward, and a fool. He was pathetic. All the anger James had held for 25 years, it just evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, empty pity. This was the man his mother had loved. This was the man who had thrown him away. He was nothing. The trial continued. But as James watched the dynamic between Richard and Isabella, two serpents devouring each other on the stand, he had no idea the real twist, the one that would break the case, and his own composure was yet to come. The trial was in its third week. Richard Sterling's testimony had damaged the defense, but it had also implicated him creating a he said, she said scenario of two corrupt executives. Isabella's defense was leaning hard on the idea that she was the scapegoat. The jury looked confused. It was then that the prosecution announced a surprise rebuttal witness. "The people call Maria Sanchez to the stand." A small, nervous-looking woman in her late 60s walked into the courtroom. She looked terrified, clutching a worn leather handbag. "Who is this?" Isabella whispered, panicked, to her lawyer. Her lawyer just shook his head, looking blindsided. The prosecutor, Anya Sharma, began. "Ms. Sanchez, where were you employed for the last 30 years?" I was an executive assistant," Maria said, her voice soft. "At Sterling Global Enterprises." "And who specifically did you work for?" "At first I worked for Mr. Sterling, back in the old building. Then I was assigned to Ms. Rossi when she was promoted." Isabella Sterling went white. "You were Isabella Rossi's personal assistant?" "Yes, for 28 years. I retired 2 years ago, right before all this, Miss Sanchez," Sharma said, walking slowly toward the witness box. "During your time as Ms. Sterling's assistant, were you aware of her financial dealings?" "Objection!" the defense yelled. "Privilege hearsay." "The witness can testify as to her own observations, counselor," James said, his eyes fixed on Maria. "Overruled. Proceed, Ms. Sharma." I saw things," Maria said, her hands shaking. "I managed her private calendars, her private travel, and I managed her private files, things that weren't on the company server. And what was in those files? She was very particular. She kept ledgers, real ones, not the ones she gave to the accountants. She had a private safe behind a painting in her office. She made me clear it out when she heard the SEC was investigating. She told me to shred everything." "And did you?" Sharma asked. Maria took a deep, trembling breath. "No, I couldn't. What she was doing, it was wrong. She wasn't a good person. She fired my son from the mailroom because he was sick for a week. Just threw him out. After I had given her 25 years. I kept a copy. Of everything. On a hard drive. I gave it to the FBI last week." The courtroom erupted. Isabella lunged forward, screaming, "You lying bitch! You were a secretary! Order!" James slammed his gavel. "Order in this court. Mrs. Sterling, one more outburst like that, and you will be held in contempt. Control your client, counselor." Isabella was forced back into her seat by her lawyers, her face a mask of pure hatred. Sharma smiled a cold, thin smile. "The prosecution would like to enter into evidence People's Exhibit 44B, the Rossi Ledger." It was a digital file projected onto the large screens. It was a forensic accountant's dream. It detailed every single fraudulent wire transfer, every shell company, every bribe. It was an undeniable, irrefutable confession of her guilt in the Helios fraud. Isabella's case was over. James watched his face impassive. Justice was being done. "But wait," Sharma said. "There's more. Ms. Sanchez, can you direct us to the folder labeled Archive? Maria nodded. Yes. Folder Vintage. Sharma clicked it. The folder opened. It contained only one subfolder. It was labeled EV Settlement, 1999. Richard Sterling, who was sitting in the front row as a material witness, shot to his feet. What is that? Sit down, Mr. Sterling, James commanded, his voice cracking for the first time. The courtroom was dead silent. James stared at the folder, his heart pounding against his ribs so hard he thought it might break them. EV, 1999. Eleanor Vance. Ms. Sharma, James said, his voice a strained whisper. What is the relevance of this file? Your Honor, Sharma, said her voice full of ice. This file created 25 years ago details the first major fraud committed by the defendant. It would seem Ms. Rossi, then a junior analyst, made her bones by proving her loyalty to Mr. Sterling. This file contains a detailed list of shadow accounts, offshore holdings, and hidden assets created with the specific purpose of concealing Mr. Sterling's true net worth from his wife during their divorce proceedings. She projected a memo. It was from Isabella to Richard. Subject EV Asset Management. Rick, I've moved the $400M from the Lehman Fund into the 3 new Cayman entities. Her lawyer will never find it. The prenup will only apply to the domestic accounts we've declared. Your unfortunate complication will be handled. The unfortunate complication. James stopped breathing. This wasn't just a corporate coup. This wasn't just an affair. This was a targeted, malicious, and criminal act designed to render a pregnant woman and her unborn child destitute. This woman, Isabella, hadn't just stolen a husband. She had stolen his mother's future. She had stolen his future. He looked at Richard Sterling. His father was staring at the screen, his face ashen. He looked genuinely shocked. He looked like he'd been betrayed too. He'd known they were hiding money, but he'd clearly never known how Isabella had done it, or how complete the deception was. He'd let her handle it, and she had, with a brutal sociopathic efficiency. James looked at the jury. They were staring, horrified. He looked at the defendant. Isabella Sterling was no longer defiant. She was staring at the screen not in anger, but with a strange, cold pride, as if admiring her own handiwork. And then James made the mistake of looking into the gallery. In the back row, a woman stood up. She was elegant, her hair a tasteful silver, her face etched with a life of struggle and dignity. It was his mother, Eleanor Vance. She had been attending the trial every day, sitting in the back, a silent, anonymous observer. James had known she was there. They hadn't spoken about it. They didn't need to. Their eyes met across the crowded, silent courtroom. He saw the tears streaming down her face. He saw 25 years of pain, of sacrifice, of lonely nights and quiet strength, all encapsulated in one single devastating look. The courtroom, the lawyers, the jury, they all faded away. There was only his mother and the woman who had tried to destroy them. James Vance picked up his gavel. His hand was not shaking. It was rock solid. "This court," he said, his voice thick with a controlled, righteous fury, "will be in recess for 10 minutes. He stood turned and walked into his chambers, the echo of his mother's silent sob following him. When Judge James Vance re-entered courtroom 26B, the atmosphere had changed. The air once filled with the eager murmurs of the press and the anxious posturing of lawyers was now dead still, suffocating. It was the silence of an execution chamber. James walked to the bench, his black robe feeling less like a garment and more like armor. He sat, and the weight of his office settled onto him, a familiar, comforting pressure. He was no longer the son. He was the court. He looked at the defense table. Isabella's lead attorney Sharon Mills looked ashen. The Rossi ledger and the EV settlement file had not just destroyed her case. They had vaporized it. "Does the defense have a closing argument?" James asked, his voice a flat, neutral tone that echoed in the tomb-like room. Mills stood, her movements stiff. She could not refute the evidence. She could not claim innocence. All she had left was a desperate plea for jury nullification. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice strained. "What you have seen, what you have heard, is a story of a complex, difficult world. A world of high-stakes finance, where the lines are blurred. Miss Sterling was a participant. Yes, but was she the architect? Or was she a product of an environment created by the man sitting in that front row, Richard Sterling? Was she ambitious? Yes. Was she ruthless? Yes. But was it all her? Or was she, in the end, the one left holding the bag for a generation of corporate malfeasance? Find the reasonable doubt in that. She sat down. It was weak, pathetic, and everyone knew it. Then the prosecutor, Anya Sharma, stood. She walked not to the jury, but to the center of the courtroom, standing directly between Isabella and Richard. "Reasonable doubt," she began, her voice a whip crack. "Let us talk about what is reasonable. Is it reasonable to believe that the defendant accidentally created 24 shell companies? Is it reasonable to believe she accidentally siphoned $4 billion from her own company? Is it reasonable to believe that the Rossi ledger, a meticulous, detailed confession of her every crime, is a work of fiction?" She walked to the jury box. "The defense wants you to see blurred lines. Let me make them clear. The defendant, Isabella Sterling, is a predator. She has been a predator for her entire career. We saw the proof. We saw the file labeled EV settlement. We saw how her career began by conspiring to criminally defraud a pregnant woman to render her and her unborn child destitute for her own personal gain. This is not a blurred line. This is a pattern. This is who she is. What she did to Eleanor Vance 25 years ago was the blueprint for what she did to Sterling Global. The only difference was the scale. She pointed at Isabella. She is not a product of her environment. She is the environment. She is the rot. Her entire life, her entire empire is a fraud. And today, that fraud ends. Find her guilty. Find her guilty on all 28 counts. Send a message that the law is not just for the poor or the weak. Send a message that titans can fall. And they must. James delivered his instructions to the jury. It was 11:00 a.m. The wait was agonizing. James sat in his chambers, not reading, not working, just staring at the Great Seal of the United States on his wall. He thought of his mother sitting in that back row, her posture a steel rod. He thought of the man in the front row, a stranger made of lies and regret. At 12:04 p.m., the buzzer rang. The jury had a verdict. It had taken them 58 minutes. All rise. The courtroom was electric, every molecule of air vibrating with tension. The jury filed in their faces, grim, unreadable. They did not look at the defendant. It was a terrible sign. Isabella was trembling, a vibration so violent her lawyer had to put a hand on her arm. Richard Sterling looked ill, his face a mottled gray. In the back, Eleanor Vance held her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Mr. Foreman James said, his voice steady. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" We have your honor. On the charge of conspiracy to commit wire fraud in violation of 18 U.S. Code Section 1349, how do you find? The foreman took a breath. Guilty. A sound half-gasp, half-sob tore from Isabella's throat. On the charge of wire fraud count 1 in violation of 18 U.S. Code Section 1343, how do you find guilty? On the charge of wire fraud count 2, how do you find guilty? On the charge of wire fraud count 3, guilty. One by one, the foreman read the verdict for all 28 counts. Each guilty was a hammer blow, a nail in the coffin of Isabella's life. With each one, she seemed to shrink, to collapse in on herself. Richard Sterling sank lower in his seat. His head in his hands, a man watching his own name being chiseled onto a tombstone. When the last guilty was read, the room was silent. Isabella was no longer crying. She was just gone. A hollow shell. James looked at his mother. Eleanor Vance had her eyes closed. A single tear, a tear of 25 years, was slowly tracing a path of vindication down her cheek. James's face was stone. He polled the jury, his voice clinical. He thanked them for their service. Sentencing, he said, looking at the defense table, will be tomorrow morning at 10:00 a.m. He banged the gavel. This court is adjourned. The next morning, the mood was different. It was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was about the price. Isabella Sterling was led in not in a tailored beige suit, but in a standard-issue, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. Her wrists were cuffed and attached to a chain around her waist. The woman who had graced the cover of Forbes, who had commanded boardrooms and terrified rivals, was now a federal prisoner. The power inversion was absolute. This court is now in session for the sentencing of the defendant, Isabella Sterling, James announced. Counselor, does your client wish to make a statement? Isabella's lawyer nodded, nudging her. Isabella stood, her chains rattling. She looked up at the bench, her eyes wild, searching, and for the first time landing on James, really seeing him, not as a judge, but as a man. Your Honor. She began, her voice a desperate, cracking whisper. Please, please, I know what this looks like. I know what you heard, but that wasn't all me. I was ambitious, yes, I made mistakes. I made terrible mistakes, but it was the world I was in. It was a man's world. I did what I had to do to survive. Richard, he demanded it. He demanded success. He pushed me. She was crying now, fat, ugly tears. I am not this monster. I'm not. I have a daughter, Chloe. She needs me. She's troubled. Please, Your Honor. I beg you for mercy. Don't take me away from my daughter. Please, I'll do anything. I'll pay it all back. Please, show mercy. She collapsed back into her chair, sobbing. James stared at her, his face a mask. He let the sound of her sobs fill the room for a long, cold moment. Mercy. James said, his voice quiet, yet it sliced through the room. You ask for mercy for your daughter. A powerful plea. He paused, his eyes locking on hers. The concept of mercy, Mrs. Sterling, implies a shared understanding of justice, and justice is a debt that must be paid. For 25 years, you have lived a life built on a foundation of malice. The jury has convicted you for the $2.4 billion fraud you perpetrated against Sterling Global. But the evidence presented to this court revealed a pattern of behavior that is singular in its cruelty. He picked up a document. The EV settlement file. You were a junior analyst. You were not surviving in a man's world. You were an architect. You saw a target, a pregnant woman, and you saw an opportunity. You saw a way to prove your value by destroying a life before it could even begin. You did not just defraud a company, Mrs. Sterling. You built your entire career on the scorched earth of other people's lives. Isabella looked up, confused. Evie, what does that have to do with— It has everything to do with it. James's voice suddenly boomed, the judicial calm cracking, revealing the righteous fury beneath. He caught himself taking a deep breath. It has everything to do with your character, with your motive, with your complete and total lack of remorse. You didn't just make mistakes. You made choices. You chose to steal. You chose to lie. You chose to destroy. He leaned forward. In your world, people were either assets to be used or liabilities to be cut. You cut Eleanor Vance. You cut your shareholders. You even in the end tried to cut Richard Sterling. In this world, in this courtroom, we do not deal in assets and liabilities. We deal in the law. And the law is not blind to a quarter-century of calculated predatory conduct. You are a serial predator, Mrs. Sterling, and the law has finally caught you. He looked at the sentencing guidelines. With the staggering dollar amount, the abuse of trust, and the sophisticated nature of the crime, the recommendation was 25 to 30 years. You ask this court for mercy, but you have never shown any. You ask me not to take you from your daughter, but you were the instrument that took a father from his son and a future from a mother. The courtroom went dead. Richard Sterling's head shot up. He stared at James, a horrifying, dawning comprehension spreading across his face. He knew. It is the sentence of this court, James said, his voice dropping to a cold, final baritone, that you, Isabella Sterling, be committed to the custody of the United States Bureau of Prisons for a term of 30 years. A sound unlike anything human came from Isabella. A high-pitched shriek of pure, agonizing disbelief. No, no, no! You can't! You can't! She lunged, trying to get over the table. Richard, Richard! Do something! You weak, pathetic fool! You let this happen! You let him do this to me! You bastard! The U.S. Marshals were on her in an instant. They hauled her to her feet, her screams echoing off the marble walls as they dragged her fighting from the courtroom. This court is adjourned, James said, his voice shaking slightly. He slammed the gavel, the sound like a gunshot. He stood turned and walked into his chambers, the echo of her screams ringing in his ears. He leaned against the door, his hands trembling, his robe feeling impossibly heavy. It was done. He took off the robe, hanging it carefully. He was just James Vance again. He opened the private side door and walked into the long, empty marble hallway. He needed air. He needed his mother. James? He stopped, his blood turning to ice. Richard Sterling was standing 20 feet away, his face a wreck of tears and confusion. James. My God, is that— Are you— James just stared at him. Richard stumbled forward, his hands out. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. About the settlement. I swear to God I didn't know she did that. I let her handle it. I never knew. You knew she was pregnant, James said, his voice flat, dead. Yes, but you knew you were abandoning your son. You knew you were leaving her with nothing. You knew, James said, taking a step toward him. The rest, the shell company's the fraud. That's just paperwork. You signed off on the execution. She just held the axe. Please, Richard whispered, tears streaming down his face. He looked pathetic, a shell of the Titan on the Forbes cover. Please, son. Can we talk? Can I just know you? I can fix this. The money, What's left? It's yours. It's hers. I can give it all to you. He was trying to buy him. After everything, he was still trying to cut a deal to write a check. James felt a cold, final emptiness. The anger was gone. The hatred was gone. There was just nothing. You have nothing I want, James said. You aren't sorry, Mr. Sterling. You're just caught. You're alone. And you've lost. James turned his back on him. At the far end of the long hall, standing in a bright shaft of sunlight from the great arched windows, was Eleanor Vance. She wasn't crying. She wasn't smiling. She was just waiting. Her as she had always been. He walked the length of the hall, his footsteps echoing each one, leaving his past further behind. He walked past the ghost of Richard Sterling, who had shrunk against a pillar, a man erased by his own choices. James walked right up to his mother. He looked at her, at the lines of strength and sacrifice etched around her eyes, and the 25 years of judicial calm, of prosecutorial steel, of a son's guarded heart, finally broke. His face crumpled. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick. She didn't hug him, not at first. She just raised her hands and cupped his face, her palms warm and familiar. She looked into his eyes not as a judge, but as her boy. "My son," she said, her voice soft but unbreakable. "My James, you brought the justice." She finally pulled him into an embrace, and he held on to her, the federal judge leaning on his mother. "It's over, baby," she whispered, stroking his hair. "It's all over. Let's go home." Together, mother and son walked out of the courthouse, their shadows long in the afternoon light. They didn't look back. And so the sins of the father were not visited upon the son, they were judged by him. Richard Sterling lost his company, his wife, and the son he never knew, all in one devastating blow. Isabella learned that a life built on deceit will always eventually crumble. And Judge James Vance and his mother Eleanor finally closed a 25-year-old wound, proving that the strongest empires aren't built on money or power, but on integrity and truth. What do you think? Did Judge James make the right call? Should he have recused himself? Or was this the only way to deliver true justice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. This story is a powerful reminder that our actions always have consequences, even if they take decades to arrive. If you were moved by this story of justice and redemption, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a powerful drama, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that will leave you breathless. Thank you for watching.